particularly the use of AI in the sphere of project controls. There's been a lot of hype and much online discussion, social media and stuff about the use of AI and the transformative effects of it. What we wanted to do was not feed into that general discussion um, or like just to kind of like show feed into that hype. We wanted to provide a um, practical starter deck for people who from the project controls community to say, okay, well, this is something which is interesting, but how do we apply it in project controls where particularly, most of the people who have, who work in that area um, have limited kind of resources in terms of capex band and then have existing PPM products. So how could we provide a starter deck to that community for them to basically go and start. So what we've tried to do in this presentation is to provide like a practical solution set. So you'll find that at the end of the presentation, we provided uh, a starter deck which gives you the Claude instructions for you to create your own AI chatbot. And that also includes, for example, the Power BI build for yourselves to kind of run the chatbot, extend it to other areas. So where we focused in is on NEC contract management and change management, compensation events, but you can extend that into, for example, Power Automate into the risk areas and stuff like that. Um, just to provide some introduction as to who I am, I'm speaking for you from Data, which is a ISO 9001 Cyber Essential certified company. I'm personally a certified fellow of the Institute of Risk Management and also a fellow of CASA and part of the Southwest Regional Board alongside Rod Whiting and Dawn Thompson. Um, so in terms of data, we have previously shown this type of innovation at on some projects, particularly where we created like a smart construction platform, where we've used AI to, for example, create a risk radar by monitoring commercial discussions and email traffic. And project libraries through natural language processing in order to identify high-risk projects through, for example, volatile statements. So then in terms of data, we primarily work in the areas of ERP integration and major projects delivery. So projects like Hinkley Point C, Alternative 3, and then major projects such as, for example, Thames Second. And we have previously been shortlisted for works which we've done, for example, at British Transport Police this year, where we've been helping them in terms of major digital transformation project. These works primarily are won in our name on the public sector contracts 2015. That's just a high level overview. Um, what you'll see today and what we're able to take away um, is a relatable project controls problem. Um, uh, that's a four-defined assurance test for you to be able to use in your own projects and reusable governance and testing templates. So there will be a QR code where you'll be able to download some of these Power BI Claude project instructions and project context for you to run this on your own. So let's just start off with like the practical side of things of how this works in the real world. Um, a real problem, life problem, which a lot of people have is, for example, a simple site request becomes a time and cost decision. So a simple example would be that you have frustrated access, and then people then need to make the decision of whether the boot can be moved, how much time that will have, what are the options. So, for example, that could be changes in shift patterns. It could be acceleration frustrated access claims to other projects. Um, there are existing PPM solutions which manage these things, such as, for example, SEMA. Then you also have other risk management platforms and project plan management platforms, where I think what we were trying to do was say, how can AI then provide a reconciliation service where they're looking at whether, for example, all of the programs are consistent, that there's not a mismatch between them, that the compliance in terms of submission requirements, in terms of, for example, the programs, the quotations are within NEC4 guidelines and project-specific guidelines, whether the routing in terms of the project instructions and the compensation events, etc., are being done by the right people, and whether the downstream platforms in terms of um, other platforms, whether it be change, risk, are consistent with what had been uh, has been recorded in terms of emails. So what we tried to do is develop an AI chatbot, which then you can then feed in files in terms of, for example, custom estimates, planning estimates, quotations, email exchanges, and then what will then happen is essentially there'll be a reconciliation service, which is done against, well, for example, project plans against other versions of project plans, um, reconciliation against, for example, an authority matrix, to see in terms of whether the routing is being done and whether people are within the project authority to make the decisions, whether these things are being done in terms of the right clauses, um, and then, for example, is the right evidence associated with it. Um, so the reason why it's kind of important is because if and what we'll show is that we can do this at the portfolio level. And the reason why that's important is then in terms of prioritizing change requests at board meetings, you then focus on the ones which are ready to essentially be reviewed, rather than focusing on, for example, change discussions where, for example, there's still a lot of work which has to be done in terms of reconciliation between project plans, quotations, etc. So that's essentially like the AI chatbot, which we've kind of developed and provided the templates for. You will see on the screen over here the various clauses that are relevant, for example, to specific compensation events, etc., quotations. Um, and what similarly the AI chatbot does is it has, for example, an NEC4 dictionary where it then looks at compliance in terms of submission requirements against these various clauses. Um, it's not perfect because each project has specific NEC clauses, set clauses of their own. And so, for example, if you were to use what has been provided, you would have to, for example, update the project context and project instructions with, for example, your own specific set clauses. But what we'll do is we'll show you how you can actually do that. Um, just in terms of housekeeping, can't really see anybody's hands going up. So please do feel free to add any messages into the chat, and we'll try to address them as we go through. Um, so why did we feel that this kind of would like be useful? Um, is we were internally trying to think, well, there's a lot of like new AI technology out there. How can we kind of implement it um, without kind of replacing what we're currently doing with uh, our PPM systems just for the sake of using, um, a new digital tool set. So how can we implement it in terms of adding value? So where we thought that that where the current process fails is that earlier warnings and compensation communications are sometimes unlinked. Time and cost forecast variances are unresolved, which means that people essentially go into the meeting room for risk resolution meetings, for compensation events meetings, and there's a mismatch in terms of quotations. Uh, uh, then, for example, decisions are absent from downstream registers. So that has downstream impacts where, for example, when you're trying to hand over to the maintainer, um, you don't have a full record in terms of the decisions made in terms of variation orders, compensation events, and then similarly, decisions are not reflected across the various PPM systems. So what we wanted to do was provide a cross-record reconciliation through, for example, ingestion of various different unstructured data, do version and variance testing, for example, different period uh, versions of project plans, um, and to provide like a structured decision pack. So that's where we felt that like an AI chatbot kind of like would add value for that specific solution. Um, just to make it more meaningful in terms of like the everyday. What we've tried to do over here is to show like what the real life challenges are for the various people. So, for example, going back to the frustrated access scenario, you will have an access interface manager who want to be confirming when and where access was actually available, who had actually booked that access. You'll then have, for example, a contract project manager who will be looking at whether restricted access changes the plan cost and time of the project. You'll, for example, have the project controls lead who will then be looking at reconciliation in terms of entitlement, in terms of who had actually um, the time risk allowance in terms of access to the project plan. Um, then it comes back to, for example, the NEC project manager who will then be able to, who will then decide the proper route in terms of escalation and resolution of of the issue. So then what we then did in terms of the digital assistant was the digital assistant basically uses four tests. The first is to see whether the required evidence is present, approved, and current. The second is to check whether the time, cost, and status and assumptions reconcile. The third was basically configuring the NEC4 rules, route and response periods. And then the fourth was to look at whether the proposed change or the issue was within the named person's authority. So essentially, then the, the from the project controls point of view was then for this AI review then to look at the controlled acceptance criteria, um, so that you can then prioritize, commercial effort on those areas where project controls can actually add value. Um, the output then is then an exception report, which then gets escalated to, for example, a commercial manager, a planning manager, a project manager, where they'll identify, for example, variations in terms of quotations, um, planning estimates, um, and then escalation paths in terms of project authority. Um, what we have on the screen over here is um, reconciling that type of mismatch with, for example, the NEC4 clauses to show that, for example, where there is, for example, um, a, a mismatch in terms of version control, how it's related back to NEC NEC4. So what the project assistant will be basically doing is they will then be looking at those exceptions and then basically identifying the various NEC4 clause which would be in violation. So these are the four tests which we provided again. Um, I might in a couple of minutes and pause the slideshow in order to show you the in-feed files. But what you basically have is a series of in-feed files and project context files to feed into the project assistant. Those being the scope of the instruction, for example, of the cloud project in this case, the various early warning and compensation advanced communications. So, for example, downloads of people's emails. Um, but you can, for example, connect it to, uh, for example, your Gmail if you wanted to. Um, Accepted program versions. So once again, that is a P6 extracts, which are then uploaded, or otherwise, for example, connection via an API into Primavera. Um, and then similarly, extracts from your risk registers, your change management records. Also, what we then also provided is an authority matrix in terms of the WBS dictionary, the budget authority, and then the authority, for example, of each project manager, and then the NEC4 role. So then when it comes back to the routing, people will then say, actually, um, this compensation event is being routed to the wrong person because it's outside of their authority. Um, so that's where the kind of like the digital exception report kind of uh, potentially adds value. Once again, the full assurance tests then whether evidence is present, approved account, whether all of the project records reconcile, that being time, cost, status, assumptions, um, whether the uh, correct NEC4 role and route have been identified, um, and whether the named human authority has been the right person has been assigned in order to be able to make the decision. So then, in terms of what we've then done, is that um, and how we implemented the chatbot was the first stage was mapping NEC4 processes and roles, um, then assigning, for example, the permitted purpose, users, and sources. The area here is, for example, the area, for example, here was just to make sure that um, the AI chatbot couldn't make any decisions on their own. They couldn't, for example, approve a change request, uh, or for example, reject any uh, 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 any change request. There was particular guardrails in terms of what they could and could not do. And then testing the output in terms of evidence, versions, consistency, and then referring, for example, where there is inconsistencies up towards, for example, rework or for acceptance. So that's basically like the three stages in terms of um, the model. Um, so below that is the controls decisions that we had, and particularly in developing the AI chatbot, um, particularly in terms of respecting the project manager as uh, rights to execute contractual decisions, so not moving away from human control. Then building up that, for example, the use cases and the controls canvas, making sure that you had a proper escalation record and then uncertainty register. So these are the types of 5 questions that we had, um, in terms of recording, keeping a record of dependencies, looking at the evidence status, the decision boundaries, the NEC for control, and then the human authority. So then when the AI chatbot then was going through, for example, each of the evidence, these are the types of tests that they would be looking at. I think it would be more useful to kind of look at the files and uh, soon. So we'll kind of go to that quickly now. Um, so here what we had is that um, the various PPM platforms still provide like a common data environment. Um, so they do provide, for example, record of transactions, quotations, approval, uh, and change forecast records. However, in some cases, these systems are disparate and they are not interconnected. So where the system can provide value is looking at evidence and then doing the reconciliation. And then, for example, then referring this back towards the NEC4 roles in terms of role, route, and response period. So, for example, was the project plan accepted within the 2 weeks period? Was the quotation responded to within 10 days? Those are the types of areas that the AI chatbot then would have a look at. And then in terms of making the decision in terms of resolving gaps and conflicting evidence. So then escalating this in terms of an exception report, which can then be prioritized. Um, so what we will show you is that for the output from the Power BI, from the AI chatbot is essentially a Power BI, which then works at the portfolio level. And what then that does is that at the commercial manager level, you can then look at all your projects to see, for example, where there is inconsistency. Once again, we have provided that Power BI report uh, uh, as a free download, so that people, if they wanted to, they have the DAX codes, the the measures and everything like that already created, and they can go and plug and play. Similarly, the same AI chatbot can be extended into, for example, other areas such as AI in terms of risk. And then also it can be connected to other tool sets, for example, Power Automate, where, for example, because you've then identified an exception report, you can then connect Power Automate to identify a series of resolution paths. So then what we've then tried to do in terms of um, is also when we set up this chatbot is to set up like a project AI controls charter. Um, and then because the thing is in some ways, what you're then doing is you're connecting a lot of disparate data together. And in some cases that you do have GDPR concerns, you do have concerns in terms of privacy, authority, exception reports, and then the right to, for example, for there to be human decisions at the end of it. So in terms of the authority matrix and the decision log. And then in terms of the escalation, so for example, uh, to have guardrails in that the AI chatbot wouldn't send an immediate escalation. There'd be a tiered escalation path up to the program manager and commercial manager. So the outputs of all of this was basically a AI starter pack. Um, and what that has is, for example, a AI control charter, use case register, contract rules register, authority matrix, and escalation routes. So what all of those documents are is that within the uh, AI chatbot, you have to have like project instructions, and then, for example, project context files, and then in terms of the project instructions and project context, those are like uh, the guardrails where you'll set the uh, project up, and then each, for example, iteration of the AI chatbot will refer back to those guardrails in order to understand, the correct escalation paths uh, and the correct rules in terms of the use cases. So, um, over here, what we've then done is like identified, for example, the permitted tasks, the permitted outputs um, that 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 we've included in terms of the chatbot. Um, and then what we've then done over here is then look at things such as, for example, the four tests in terms of the evidence version, records agreement, contract risk escalation, and then the human authority. Um, I think we've talked about this at length, but in terms of what we provided, um, is things such as, for example, um, looking at ways of applicable set courses, access dates, delay periods, assumptions. And that's how, for example, the AI chatbot can look at all of the various entries. So just to make this a bit more meaningful, these are the types of files that, for example, are then provided in terms of templates, in terms of the starter pack. So like in terms of the four test parts and stuff like that. So this is, for example, like the CBS hierarchy, the authority matrix, the WBS hierarchy. And then the output of that, which we'll come back to later, is, for example, a Power BI report. So the way it works is then you then will feed in to, for example, the AI digital assistant, or for example, your unstructured data in terms of, for example, emails uh, between people. These are all fictitious emails. But what we would then do is feed into the AI engine things such as, for example, the email exchanges, the response structures that we have, the WBS dictionary, the CBS dictionary. And what will then happen is then you will then get, for example, a portfolio level view where across the various projects, you will then be able to see the various compensation events. What you'll then be able to then see is take, for example, this project where there's frustrated access. That was related to see compensation event 18. And then what you're then able to then do is you're able to then drill down into the particular project. You would then be able then to see, for example, the respective assurance tests, you know, so which is the version, you know, what is the evidence, what is the required action in terms of resolution. So this is just to pause the formal presentation, just to basically make it a bit more meaningful as to like how the AI chatbot can add value practically. Going back to the formal presentation. So that should provide some like real life project context in terms of like how this is done in the real world. What then going back to like the theory section of it is that um, if you think that the full control tests which we have is evidence version, records agreement, NEC for root escalation, human authority, etc. You then have like certain acceptance standards, and then what you then have is, for example, um, certain critical failures and partial failures. And what then the AI chatbot then would then do is then develop a balanced scorecard approach. which is that's what's reflected in terms of the Power BI when we go and deep dive into it. And what that will then say is that if, for example, everything agrees, then you get a score of 2. If there's a clear failure, then you get 0. If there's a partial failure, then, for example, you get 1. And then that gets you a balanced scorecard approach where you then can then at the portfolio level view, then identify the areas of the key gaps. So that's the exception report. Then, for example, there's like in terms of the authority matrix and then the decision flow for the AI chatbot, this is basically then how uh, it then looks at is like how is the treatment, for example, of failures, and then what is the escalation part that you, for example, use. Um, this type of we don't kind of need to go into the detail of that. But then what you can then do in terms of the communication flows is then extend this out to say, for example, if there was a mismatch in terms of uh, planning forecasts between version 6 and version 7 of your project plan, or there was a difference in terms of quotations, would that, for example, trigger external communications via Automate to then involve other people and then automate that type of reworking of the evidence. So this is the type of things that kind of like when designing like an AI chatbot that we kind of have to think about. Um, so the demo which we were kind of like deep diving over here and now is that we set up like, for example, a control review um, of like a particular change uh, compensation event in terms of compensation event 18. We set up permitted failures in terms of mismatches, in terms of between versions. Um, we then ran 4 different assurance checks, in order to basically be able to test the evidence, record consistency, and NEC for routing and human authority. So then, in terms of those different 4 scenarios, what you will then see in, for example, the Power BI deep dive is 4 different scenarios of like errors. One was everything matched, that's S1. So that the records agreed, uh, you know, the program plans agreed, etc. And the second scenario, there was a mismatch between project plans, um, and then in terms of S3, that there was conflicting records between different versions of the project plan, you know. Um, and then in terms of S4, whereas human authority was that the evidence reconciled, but basically a project assistant was being asked to accept and implement a change where that was outside of the project authority. And that had to be rerouted to, for example, the correct project manager. So then the output, for example, of the project assistant was the Excel scorecard, the JSON results, and then the word assurance reports. So the word assurance report basically is a deep dive in terms of each of these exceptions, and which will then say, okay, this is the problem which has come. So the dashboards, um, the 3 dashboard reviews which we created, one which basically shows you at the portfolio level, and then we then go and deep dive into a particular compensation event, and then show you how, for example, the decisions can be managed. So the same protests, for example, have different routings and what's permitted. Um, and then what you will then see, for example, in terms of the Power BI report is there'll be, for example, 8 different open actions, 2 critical actions, and then certain things are reserved for the project manager. So then how this would probably, for example, work in the real life is that um, a senior project controls manager or a change manager would then use this as an engine in order to, for example, manage um, their the change management compensation events at the portfolio program level. So then, in terms of like deep diving it into the demo a bit further, um, what you'll then see is, like, for example, actions by owners to identify who's, for example, got open actions against them. Um, so that's what's in the various reports. And then the final view, what then happens is that this gets converted into assurance findings. So it's essentially like a report, um, which then gives you that, which is then able to then be routed to the various project principles. So this is a recorded demo, for example, of the Power BI report. Separate to this is different Word reports which have been configured, um, which kind of deep dive into all of this. What has been showing over here is we walk through the different scenarios. So, for example, where S2 or S1, where S1, for example, all the project records matched. In terms of S3, you can see that there's a mismatch, and then there's different, for example, tests. Um, this then goes into, for example, the third page, where we then deep dive in terms of, for example, what the open actions are, what the NEC for controls are, and what the various clauses are. Um, so then, how can, for example, people use this type of thing in their own project environment? Um, is sorry for the typo over there, is defining the control need. So, for example, what the process is in terms of decision rules, records, setting the AI rules that comes back to the authority matrix, and proving the purpose, and then the stop conditions, and then assembling the evidence, and then testing, establishing the testing conditions and the routing. Um, and then uh, key to this was setting the guardrails in terms of human interaction, in terms of human acceptance and rework decisions. So this is how, for example, you can have a targeted implementation in terms of AI in a project controls environment, but then what you then do is you still retain the existing PPM systems that you have, but you then also be respectful in terms of the authority decisions, and of humans in terms of the project authority. So, uh, so I think the screen froze, and that's why I stopped there for a second. Just 1 second. So I'm going to kind of deep dive in terms of in terms of the various reports uh, in a second. Um, but this is just, for example, showing you in terms of like how like the um, the AI chatbot, which has been supplied to you as an example, can add value in terms of, for example, whether uh, checking, for example, whether the risks are current, the owners reflect uh, the owners are relevant, the relevant contractual route has been identified, the response clocks been recognized in terms of response times for programs, acceptance, quotation acceptance, um, for, the period versions correct, and our totals correct. So these are the types of control areas that the current AI solution has been extended into, um, and where it can be extended to and further. Um, so what you can, for example, configure in terms of the starter pack is your various thresholds, action owners, escalation routes, evidence packs using the same format. So the QR code has been supplied here. Um, so I think the PDF of this will be circulated by the controls and the CASA team. But essentially, what will be within that starter pack is the use cases, the controls canvas, um, the project's AI control charter, the toolbox talks, which you can, for example, use the reporting format, the four test assurance checklist, and the evidence exception report. I'll bring that up on the screen before the formal close. But if, for example, you can be quick and uh, and take out your phone and take a picture of the QR code, you then will be able to navigate to a WordPress site where you can download uh, the zip file. Um, and that will have, for example, the Power BI report, the various Claude uh, input files that you can use. So just in terms of like closing the formal presentation, what we've tried to do in this presentation is to show one real project controls decision. So starting off, for example, with a real life problem in terms of frustrated access. Uh, why does it matter to, for example, people on the ground? Who does it affect? For example, interface managers, the commercial managers, NEC for project manager, project controls manager. What are the things that they're thinking about when something like this happens? How, for example, a targeted implementation of an AI chatbot can reconcile records between PPM systems. Um, and then, for example, how we've kind of tried to structure the build in terms of the development. So in terms of looking at the use cases, structuring in terms of the tests, the conditions that have to be met in terms of the AI guardrails, how that is kind of reflected. And then, for example, the control areas, whether it be in risk, change management, um, NEC for governance authority. So how do we build that kind of model, and how does that get then reflected back in terms of an exception report? So then, in terms of the configuring of the scorecard, but then also in terms of the follow-on actions from that scorecard in terms of deciding how to rework and to refer decisions, and then how to retest. So this is the end of the formal presentation. I was just going to spend a bit of time kind of deep diving into the various Power BI reports, but I don't mind, and then the Word reports, but I don't mind taking questions here now.
Sachin, thank you. There are a couple of questions that have gone into the Q&A, and I'm also conscious that it's nearly 1. So we've got just about 10 minutes left. So the first question was, many organizations will not have access to Claude AI. How transferable are the developed prompts?
So, I mean, you could, for example, many organizations still would have access to, for example, Copilot. So you could, for example, try to recycle them towards Copilot. where we've just used Claude because to set up in terms of things such as like the project instructions, the project context. Um, you can still use the existing build, and it could be, for example, easier in with, for example, the integration um, with other SharePoint and Office applications. But to be honest, um, we haven't kind of tested it with, for example, uh, uh, we haven't taken the outputs and then put it into Copilot to see if it worked. Yeah,
Okay, lovely,
yeah.
thank you. Then another question. I just wanted to understand the scope of the testing that's being carried out. Is it simply verifying that the required supporting artifacts are present, or is there also a quality assessment involved? And then there's a for example, are they checking not only that the artifacts exist, but also that they appear to have been developed correctly and to an appropriate standard?
So the reconciliation looks at, for example, whether the totals, so for example, checksum totals. It then also looks at, for example, the version controls, and whether the different version controls are supported, for example, by different change, by previous compensation events. It does then look at, for example, the reconciliation between the different emails. Exchanges between project managers to show whether there's a mismatch in terms of interpretation of past email exchanges and past change requests. So it does do that in terms of qualitative. So it's not only, for example, looking at it's not a simple checksum total. Then the other thing which has been done is to cross-reference that to a NEC4 dictionary in terms of looking at whether it's compliant with NEC4 clauses. So, uh, this was kind of like a use case which is developed particularly for CASA in terms of how it could be, for example, be used. You know.
Okay, lovely. Well, I've got no other questions. I don't know if there's anything that anybody wants to put in chat. Otherwise, I think you were going to go into giving some further share some further information, weren't you, with just a couple of moments left to go?
Yeah, I'll just do that in a second. So yes, so hopefully people can see the screen now.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of information to kind of share. One of the things which is in the QR code is things such as like access to the Claude input files and the project Power BI reports, etc. But then what you'll also see is, for example, the type of exception reports that come out of the AI chatbot. So this is like a Word report, which what we then did was we configured it to include, for example, uh, uh, branding. So this can be customized for your own company's branding. And what then happens is this is the type of like decision briefs that come out of it. Going back to the question which was raised by one of the delegates in terms of the type of quality and the records that come out of it. So this is one exception report in terms of like what is the evidence and correspondence which reviewed, and um, you know, the dimensions in terms of looking at commercial risk forecast, cross reference, and that. This is quite a lot. to kind of look into. So that's the reason why what we've then developed and made available for people is the project Power BI report, which then looks at, for example, things such as critical failures, quotations, and stuff like that. So then you then have, like, for example, control buttons, where what you can then do is you can then flip, for example, to see what the different actions are, you know. And then what the different NEC flow clauses are. So then this then can be then extended in terms of your own decisions and evidence requirements. So this is just basically just providing an introduction. Hopefully it's useful for people.
That's great. Thank you. I was going to say, I know you've said that we will share. As I said, this will go on to YouTube, but in terms of the slides that you've shared, I've obviously got them and I will put them up on behind the members portal under the probably under professional discussion forum, just to say we've had this event and here's access to the data. So those of you that are members and are able to get into behind your members firewall, you will see this information that has been shared today for you to access as well through that route.
Nice. Thank you.
No, that's no problem at all.
Yeah.
So thank you, Sachin, for today. I know you are on a very different continent to most of us, and so the internet has worked as we've gone through this last hour. Thank you for that. Anybody wants any questions, they can reach out to Sachin again through the through the members portal, or with LinkedIn, or by email. And I would just encourage the rest, you to have a look at the other events that we are hosting over the next 6 weeks. There's quite a wide range, from forensic planning to commercial events to risk events. Some of those face-to-face, some of those webinars, and they're all on our events calendar. So I will give you back a couple of moments of your lunch. Thank you again, and hope to speak to you and see many of you soon.
Thank